Welcome back to Conversations about Bookbinding, coming to you from Bookforge in Erie, Pennsylvania. And we're taking a deep dive, into a tool that has been around for centuries in bookbinding, the sewing frame. You guys sent in some really fascinating sources on this, and I have to say, I'm ready to geek out.
It is really surprising how much history and just how much innovation is packed into what seems like such a simple device. When you think about the sewing frame, it really does give you this unique perspective on just how bookbinding has developed.
You're so right,
Yeah.
because it's not just holding the pieces together, it's like shaping the whole structure of the book, even how it feels. And one thing that just blew me away was this image from a 12th century German manuscript showing a binder using a sewing frame, like almost 1,000 years ago, and they were already on to something.
It just shows how fundamental this tool is, to bookbinding. I mean, the basic concept has remained the same for centuries. But of course, there have been some really fascinating, refinements and developments along the way.
So for anyone listening who's never actually used a sewing frame, can you kind of break down the anatomy of a traditional sewing frame?
Yeah. So picture this. You have a flat wooden base, and that's your foundation. At each end, you have these uprights, strong posts, and those are threaded. And then there is a horizontal bar that rests on the uprights. And you create tension by turning the nuts on these uprights, and that raises the bar, and that puts tension on the sewing supports.
Ah, yes, the sewing supports,
Yeah.
right? Those are the cords or tapes that you actually sew the sections of the book onto.
Yeah.
So the frame is really all about keeping those supports nice and taut and evenly spaced. And that's what gives you a really solid structure for the book. It's almost like, the backbone before you actually make the backbone.
Exactly. That tension, that spacing, that's really crucial. And it's just so interesting to see how, throughout history, bookbinders have adapted and improved that basic sewing frame.
Well, speaking of adaptations, one of our sources had, it was a bookbinding manual from 1745, and it had this crazy illustration, a sewing frame with a built-in candle holder.
A candle holder? You know what? That's genius. That's thinking outside the box, right?
Yeah.
Good lighting has always been so essential, for precise work.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But, it wasn't just quirky additions. We actually see, like, some real innovation happening over time. So Sidney Cockrell, for instance, he introduced these solid, what are they called? Cantilevered uprights to improve rigidity. And then in the 1960s, John Corduroy actually mentions a folding sewing frame. A folding sewing frame. Imagine that back in the day.
That's amazing. It shows that there has always been this drive to refine and improve, right? Every generation of bookbinders, they look at the tools and they ask, how can we make this better? Which brings us to, a really good example, a modern example, the Noki sewing frame. And it's a really good example of how traditional tools can benefit from modern design thinking.
Oh, I love the Noki. The Noki is great.
Yeah.
It's like the sewing frame on a mission. The folding design, that alone is brilliant for storage. And it's made out of this solid aluminum, so it's super strong. And then they have these easy-to-use buttons for adjusting the supports. No more fiddling with wing nuts.
And what's really remarkable about the Noki is it doesn't just improve the practicality of it, it enhances the functionality.
Yeah.
I mean, those buttons, they allow for incredibly fine adjustments, and it gives the binder so much more control over the final product.
Okay, so we've got, centuries of innovation, from candle holders to these high-tech buttons. But I got to admit, the thing that made me laugh were those historical examples of sewing frames made from chairs.
The chair is a sewing frame.
Yeah.
You have to admire the resourcefulness, but it does make you appreciate a dedicated, well-constructed frame.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
A wonky chair is not going to cut it if you want a beautiful book. So what actually makes for a well-built sewing frame? What should we be looking for?
Well, stability is key, paramount, really. The frame needs to be rock solid, no wobbling or shifting, especially while you're sewing. Imagine trying to keep that even tension when the whole thing is moving around.
Yeah, that's a recipe for a disaster, or at least a very, very wonky book. What else is crucial?
Proper alignment. The supports need to be perfectly perpendicular to that base, so if they're off kilter, it can really throw off the entire sewing process and ultimately the structure of the book.
So we've got stability and alignment. Anything else? It feels like there's a third point here, like a trifecta of sewing frame perfection.
Of course. Smooth operation. The nuts that you use to adjust the tension, they should turn easily and smoothly. You don't want to be wrestling with them, especially when you need to make those fine adjustments. It should feel effortless.
Okay, so sturdy, straight, and smooth. Those are our must-haves.
Yeah.
Now, we've been talking about sewing frames in general, but I know there are distinct types, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not all sewing frames are created equal.
You're right. We can broadly categorize them, into three main types. You have your hand sewing frames, machine sewing frames, and then your Coptic sewing frames, each designed for a specific task, a specific technique.
Okay, so let's break those down, starting with the hand sewing frame, the one that we've kind of been picturing this whole time. This is like the classic, right? The OG sewing frame.
Exactly. The hand sewing frame, it's all about manual control, that precision. It really lets you feel the thread as you sew, and that connects you directly to the process.
And then we have the machine sewing frame. What sets that one apart?
Well, I think the name kind of gives it away, but it's designed to be used with a sewing machine. So this really brings speed and efficiency to the process. And this can be really useful, especially when you're working on larger books or if you need to make multiple copies.
Got it. So speed and consistency. That's where the machine sewing frame shines, which leaves us with the Coptic sewing frame. What's special about this one?
The Coptic sewing frame is specifically for Coptic binding, and that's a technique that has its roots in early Christian texts, from Egypt actually. And Coptic binding uses this really unique vertical sewing pattern, and the frame is designed to help with that specific stitch.
So we have three different types of frames, each with its own strengths and each with its own applications. It's amazing to think that this, what seems like a simple tool, has been around for centuries, playing such a crucial role in creating the books we love.
And it's not just about the past. The sewing frame is still so fundamental, for both traditional and modern bookbinding. Whether you are a seasoned professional or you're just starting out, it's a tool that lets you create strong, durable, and aesthetically pleasing books.
And you know what? There is something so visually appealing about a well-sewn text block. Just those nice, neat rows of stitches and the gentle curve of the spine. It really speaks to the skill and the care of the bookbinder.
Absolutely. The sewing frame is what helps transform that stack of loose pages into something that's cohesive. It's more than just a tool. It's like an integral part of the book's journey.
Yeah, it's a beautiful reminder that even in today's digital age, there's just something so enduring and magical about the craft of bookbinding. And you know what? This seemingly simple act of sewing is at the heart of it all.
And the sewing frame is right there in the center. Providing the foundation, the structure, the framework for that magic to happen. It really is magical how those pages come together, right? To become a unified book. And you think about, all the hands that have worked on these frames over the centuries, all the stories that they've helped to bind together. It's kind of moving, when you think about it like that.
It is. You're right. It's like the frame itself absorbs some of that bookbinding history. It's like a silent witness to how the craft has evolved over time. Every little dent, every scratch, every ink stain, it's like it's telling a story.
Exactly. And those historical examples, even the ones that we kind of laughed at, like those chair contraptions, they really do give you a glimpse into how resourceful and ingenious bookbinders have had to be throughout history.
Oh, yeah. Those chair sewing frames, they were really something else.
Yeah.
But they definitely make you appreciate a well-built, purpose-built frame.
Absolutely. That dedicated frame, it allows for that consistency and control, and that allows the bookbinder to really focus on the artistry of the sewing itself.
Speaking of artistry, I've always been curious about the different types of sewing supports. Are they purely functional, or do they kind of play a role in how the book looks, like the aesthetics?
That's a really great question. And honestly, sewing supports are way more than just functional. They're like this fundamental design element, and they really influence the book's structure, its durability, and yeah, even how it looks.
So let's kind of break it down. What are the main types of sewing supports and what makes them different?
Okay, so the two main types, you have your cords and you have your tapes. Cords are usually made from linen or hemp, and they're round. And this creates those raised bands that you see running across the spine of a lot of older books.
Oh, yeah, those raised bands. So they're not just decorative then.
No, they're not. They serve multiple functions. Aesthetically, they add that tactile and visual element, they kind of break up the spine, give it that classic look. But they also add strength and flexibility, which allows the spine to curve nicely when you open the book.
Okay, so cords are about strength, flexibility, and that traditional aesthetic. What about tapes? What do those bring to the table?
Tapes are typically made from linen or cotton, and they are flat strips. So they give you this wider surface area for sewing, which can be helpful, especially for heavier books or books that are printed on delicate paper.
That makes a lot of sense. So tapes are a good option when you need a little extra support and a wider sewing surface. Do they affect how the spine looks differently than cords do?
Yeah, they do. So with tapes, you'll get a smoother spine without those pronounced raised bands that you get from the cords. It's definitely more subtle, and a lot of people prefer that for modern book designs.
So it's like a choice between that classic charm of those raised bands or like the sleekness of a tape sewn spine. It's amazing how even those little details can make such a big difference in the final product.
Yeah, it's those little details, that often distinguish a truly well-crafted book. And speaking of details, I know that you are really interested in Coptic binding. You mentioned it a little earlier with the Coptic sewing frame, but the sewing technique itself is really worth exploring a little more.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've always been intrigued by Coptic binding, with that exposed stitching on the spine. It's just so different from the traditional Western style. What makes it so unique?
Well, unlike traditional sewing, where the sections are sewn horizontally across the spine, Coptic binding uses, it's like a vertical chain stitch, and that actually links the sections together. It's almost more like weaving than sewing.
Weaving. I love that. It's a great way to think about it. So instead of having those hidden stitches, Coptic binding basically shows them off.
Exactly. You end up with this very visually striking spine with that exposed stitching. And it's also incredibly durable. And because of how those sections are linked together, books that are Coptic bound, they tend to lay flat, which makes them perfect for journals, sketchbooks, and even some types of reference books.
It seems like from the materials to the techniques, the sewing really plays such a key role in shaping the book's personality, its functionality, and yeah, even how it looks.
It really does. And the sewing frame is right there in the middle of it all, providing that structure, that stability, to execute those choices, whether it's with cords or tapes or even that Coptic chain stitch.
It's fascinating to think about how the sewing frame, which seems like such a simple tool, is really like a bridge between the bookbinder's ideas and the final book. It's almost like an extension of the bookbinder's hand.
I love that. That's a great way to put it. The sewing frame isn't just a device, It's like this conduit for creativity, It's a partner in the bookbinding process. And as we've seen, it's a tool that has consistently adapted and evolved alongside the craft itself.
Speaking of evolution, I keep thinking about those future innovations. What do you think the sewing frame of tomorrow will look like?
Ooh, that's a really good question. We've already talked about, that move towards those more ergonomic and efficient designs like the no-key, but what if we took it a step further?
I know, right? Any predictions? What's your bookbinding crystal ball telling you?
Well, I think we might start seeing technology being incorporated.
Yeah.
Like imagine a sewing frame that actually interacts with design software, and allows for super precise computer-aided stitching patterns.
Wow, that's amazing. It's almost like a 3D printer for books. Do you think that would take away from that handcrafted element, or could it open up some new possibilities?
That is an interesting question. I think it could go either way, honestly. Some bookbinders might embrace it and see it as a way to push the boundaries, and explore new designs. But then others might want to stick with the traditional techniques. I think ultimately, it'll come down to individual choices.
Yeah, you're right. It's not about replacing the human element. It's about, giving us more tools and seeing where those tools can take us. Maybe we'll have self-tensioning frames that adjust automatically, or even frames that can work with unconventional materials, and that's something that could really push the boundaries of book structure.
I love that. A frame that's all about the unexpected, encouraging bookbinders to experiment and innovate, The possibilities really are endless.
It is exciting to think about the future of bookbinding.
Hmm.
But no matter how much technology changes the tools, I do think there will always be a place for that connection, that fundamental connection between the bookbinder, the frame, and the book.
Absolutely. It's that hands-on experience, that really makes bookbinding special. It connects us to the history of the book, and it lets us create something tangible, something that will last.
And speaking of lasting, I'm curious about different sewing techniques, and you know how long they last. So we talked about cords and tapes, but what about that Coptic stitch? How does its durability compare to more traditional methods?
Coptic sewing is incredibly strong. That vertical chain stitch creates such a secure binding. And because the stitching is exposed, if there is any wear and tear, it's really easy to spot. Which means you can make repairs before there is any major damage.
So it's durable and it's easy to repair.
Yeah.
That's a great combination.
Yeah.
It really does sound like the ideal binding, for books that are meant to be handled a lot.
You're absolutely right, and it's a real testament to the skill of those early bookbinders in Egypt. They developed this technique that wasn't only beautiful, it was remarkably functional.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. Whether it's the sewing frame, the supports, or even the stitching, every aspect of bookbinding is really about creating books that are both beautiful and built to last.
It is. It really is all about finding that balance between form and function. It's about understanding those materials and using them in a way that honors the book.
And recognizing that even the smallest details, like what kind of sewing support you use or even the tension on the frame, all of that can have a big impact on the final book.
Oh, absolutely. It's all connected. From the way that the book opens to the way it feels in your hand, every little detail impacts the reading experience.
Yeah. It's a reminder that bookbinding is more than just a craft. It's an art. And that sewing frame, in all of its different forms, plays a key role in that transformation.
I couldn't agree more. It really is the foundation, on which the magic of bookbinding happens. It's that silent partner, that unsung hero of the craft.
Well said. And with that beautiful thought, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the world of sewing frames. It's been quite a journey.
It really has, and it's been such a pleasure exploring this fascinating tool with you. I hope our listeners have gained, a new appreciation for the history, the craftsmanship, and all of the possibilities of the sewing frame.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic anatomy of a sewing frame, to all the nuances of those different sewing techniques, and even, the exciting potential of those future innovations.
We've only scratched the surface. There's still so much more to learn, and to explore about bookbinding.
Absolutely. But I think we've given our listeners a great foundation to start with. And speaking of starting, we would love to hear from you guys. What surprised you the most about the sewing frame? What kind of innovations would you like to see? Share your thoughts and keep this conversation going.
As we've been talking, I've kind of realized something. This whole deep dive into sewing frames has really shown us how everything in bookbinding is connected. It's like every choice that you make, every tool that you use, even every material, it's all part of this larger conversation about the book itself.
That's a great point. It really isn't just about those individual parts. It's about how they all come together.
Yeah.
And the sewing frame is a great example of that.
Right. Because it's literally what's holding everything together, but it also, has an impact on how the book opens, how the pages feel, even how the spine flexes. It's both structural and aesthetic. Exactly. And that brings us back to innovation. We've talked about computer-aided stitching, self-tensioning frames, but what about materials? What if we could create sewing supports that were even stronger, even more flexible, or even made from, unconventional materials?
Oh, I like that. What if you had sewing supports that were made from biodegradable materials or even infused with some kind of archival quality adhesive? That could totally change book preservation and sustainability.
That's a great idea. It would be amazing to see bookbinding become more eco-conscious. And think about the possibilities for artistic expression. Like, what if you could use conductive threads to create interactive books or even incorporate materials that emit light into the sewing supports?
Wow. Books that light up or books that respond to your touch. That is amazing. It's crazy to think about where this craft could go.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that, bookbinding is always changing, always evolving. It's about pushing the boundaries and finding new ways to be creative.
And it all comes back to that foundation, that one tool that's been around for centuries, the sewing frame.
It really does. It's a tool that embodies the patience, the precision, the artistry of bookbinding,
Yeah.
And whether it's a simple wooden frame or some high-tech creation, the sewing frame will always be a vital part of this craft.
Well said. It has been an absolute pleasure, exploring the world of sewing frames with you. I feel like we've learned so much history and innovation. It's inspiring.
The pleasure was all mine, really, and I hope that our listeners have enjoyed this deep dive as much as we have.
And, if you are feeling inspired and you want to try out some bookbinding yourself, be sure to check out Bookforge here in Erie, Pennsylvania. Edward Patrick Kranz and the whole team there offer a wide variety of classes and workshops for all skill levels.
And if you just want to continue the conversation, we would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, share your questions, share your sewing frame adventures with us.
Until next time, happy bookbinding, everyone. May your stitches be strong and your books even stronger.